I'd like to take a minute to briefly explain the differences in drawing pencils. H stands for hard. An H pencil will be scratchy and have a lighter value. B stands for black. A black pencil will be softer and have a darker value. Notice the differences in values and thicknesses of these lines. HB will be thinner, harder, and lighter. 2B is a standard graphite and found in most pencils. The 4B, though it's not the softest pencil, it's the softest pencil that I will use for my demonstration. Notice it's thicker and darker. If you don't have these pencils, don't worry about it. You can do the entire drawing, your entire still life drawing, with the 2B pencil. To prepare for the mini still life drawing that you'll do today, I'd like for you to practice a few exercises. The first one will be a test in value. Using a 2B pencil, I want you to make a value scale, a very tiny value scale just under these words. So I'm starting with a very light pressure, and I'm trying to move my pencil maybe 1/8 of an inch, keeping a very controlled stroke pattern. And as I move to the right, I'm adding more pressure to create a darker value. All of this with just the 2B pencil. Notice the placement of my hand on the pencil. I'm not choked up close to the tip, but a little farther back. More pressure means I choke up farther on the pencil. I'm going to go back, little light pressure on the left, and then maybe some cross-hatching on the right, the far right, for a darker value. This is how you can shade your drawing. This is how you should shade your drawing. Exercise number 2 is a pressure test. Draw 2 lines. The first, press down really hard with your pencil, and then the second, back up on the pencil and create a light line. Erase the lines. Notice the first line that you drew, the dark line, you won't be able to pick up all the graphite with the eraser. That's the first mistake with pressing down too hard. The line will always show up as dark, no matter how well you erase it. And try to shade over both of the lines you drew. Notice the line that was drawn lightly, you cannot see under the shading. But the other line has scarred the paper. Our final exercise today is a tiny little 10-minute still life test. During this test, you will focus on constructive drawing, using light pressure, and then the correct way to shade your still life drawing, using layers. The purpose of the constructive method is to work out proportions for a realistic drawing. Start with a small rectangle, and then you can begin figuring out where the top and the bottom of the eraser go. Remember also to use a very light pressure to prevent scarring. I'll make a small mark closer to the right side of my rectangle, which represents my paper, towards the top to show where the top of the eraser goes, and then another one at the bottom. Since my eraser is symmetrical, I will draw a very light line of symmetry to help me make the eraser the same on both sides. This line will be erased later. The top of the eraser is a little longer than the bottom, so I'm finding my horizontal line of symmetry and then making a line for the top portion. Constructive drawing means finding the simplest shapes to use to begin the drawing. So I noticed that the top portion of my eraser looks a lot like a trapezoid. Even though it's rounded and more organic, I will begin with a trapezoid. using 2 diagonal lines on each side of the eraser. I'm also paying attention to the line of symmetry and trying to make these lines equidistant from that line of symmetry. Again, very light pressure with my hand backed up on the pencil. I've noticed a mistake here, so I'm correcting it. I need to add a little bit more length to the top portion. Just because you start out with constructive lines and shapes doesn't always mean you get them correct. Make corrections as you go, always. The bottom portion of the eraser is cylindrical, but I'll use a simple trapezoid to describe this part as well, as the bottom is a little smaller than the part that connects to the top. Very light lines, very light pressure. You should be learning how to sketch. Sketch means light pressure, light lines. This is the basic shape of my eraser, but this is just the constructive drawing portion. Next, I need to lightly erase all of the stray marks and the constructive lines that I no longer need, such as the line of symmetry. Now I'm ready to make the shapes look more organic, more natural, like the cap eraser. So the bottom, I need a slight curve. I'm also going to mark in places where I see different values. The right side, most of the right side of the eraser is lighter in value, and most of the left side is darker. There's a highlight or very light value at the top, so I've just made a very light mark to represent that. This line, again using very light pressure, is meant to represent the darkest shading on the left side of the eraser. And because the top portion and the bottom portion of the eraser are in 2 different places, that line needs to be farther to the right on the bottom portion. Always observe your object. Pay attention. Really look at it. 90% of drawing is observation. This line represents the middle value and then the lightest value on the right side of the eraser. My light source will be coming from the right side. And then this line, I will barely do any shading at all, but I notice there's some at the bottom. So this is the highlight of the right side of the eraser. Don't forget the shadow. Notice the angle. Remember, the shadow will fade out as it's farthest from its source. I'm not going to bother to finish it on the left side. I just need to make it believable. So I'm sketching in where it goes. Because the eraser is round, I'm adding a tiny sliver of very light value, a line to represent that, on the darkest side of the eraser, so that I will not forget, and I'll include that. Next, I will shade in layers. I'm going to begin with one of the light values on the right side of the eraser. This stroke pattern is way too long for my tiny little drawing. I need to keep my stroke pattern controlled and very short. In the center area, I will use a little more pressure. I'll press down just a little harder, but not so much that I'm smashing the texture of the paper. The idea is to bring out the texture of the paper. A little bit harder pressure to show a difference in value. Occasionally, when I shade, I also correct the drawing, making it look a little bit more organic here with those rounded edges at the top. As I move closer to the left, I increase the pressure, but I always keep a very controlled, short stroke pattern. The right side of the eraser calls for very light pressure. I want to create the illusion of our light source on the right, so I need to be very careful with this 2B pencil not to press down too hard. Before calling the eraser finished, I want to go back in with a few fine details, some darker darks in some places, and maybe if I need to use my eraser to pull out some lights. Don't forget this step, it's very important. This is called refinement. It's okay to spin the drawing paper around to get easier angles for shading. And though the shadow may not seem as important as the eraser, if you're messy or you lose control when you create the shadow, it will become a distraction. So make sure that you're maintaining a good controlled stroke pattern and easy pressure. I'll go in over parts of the shadow and make it a little darker. Now it's your turn. This tiny still life drawing of an eraser is your assignment for today. Remember to begin with constructive drawing, use light pressure, and then finish with shading and layers. Replay and pause my tutorial as often as you need to create this tiny little still life drawing of an eraser.